The first thing my father said that night wasn't Happy New Year. It was, "Don't embarrass yourself." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The words landed anyway, sharp and familiar the way they always did when he wanted to remind me of my place. We were standing in my parents' living room, crowded with relatives, half-empty champagne flutes, and the artificial sparkle of another celebration I never quite belonged to. My grandfather had just handed each of us a check-thick paper formal handwriting, the kind you don't joke about, and my mother was already laughing. "They're fake," she said loudly, waving her hand like she was brushing away dust. "He does this every year." My brother laughed and dropped his check on the coffee table like it was a receipt he didn't need. My sister folded hers once, twice, and slid it into her purse without even looking at the amount. Around us, people smiled politely, already moving on, already deciding this moment didn't matter. I looked down at mine. $1 million. I didn't gasp. I didn't say anything. I just stood there holding it carefully like it might dissolve if I didn't. That was when my father leaned closer, his mouth near my ear, his tone almost kind. "Seriously," he said. "Don't go to the bank. You don't deserve that kind of attention." Everyone laughed again, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet resolve that scared me more than their mockery ever had. I folded the check and slipped it into my bag. And in that moment, I decided I was going to find out who was lying. The rest of the night blurred together after that. Glasses clinked. Someone turned the music up. My mother told the same story she always told about my brother's natural leadership, while my sister soaked up compliments about her engagement. No one asked me anything. No one ever did. I was 26 years old, and I had learned long ago how to disappear in my own family. Growing up, I was the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who didn't need help. When I got good grades, it was expected. When I struggled, it was inconvenient. My parents liked to say I was independent, but what they really meant was that I didn't require investment. My brother, on the other hand, was promising. My sister was delicate. I was fine. I had built my life around that word. Fine meant taking out loans without complaint. Fine meant working weekends while my friends traveled. Fine meant nodding when my father dismissed my ideas and smiling when my mother forgot my birthdays. So when my grandfather handed me that check, something old and buried stirred awake. He hadn't smiled the way the others did. He had looked at me directly, his eyes steady, his hand firm when he passed the envelope into mine. There was no joke in his expression, no performance, just intention. "You take care of yourself," he'd said quietly, too quietly for anyone else to hear. That was why I believed him. After midnight, people started leaving in clusters, pulling on coats, calling rides, hugging goodbye. My brother left without saying a word to me. My sister kissed my cheek absently, already texting someone else. My parents didn't notice when I slipped out the door. The air outside was cold and clean, the kind of winter air that makes everything feel sharper. I sat in my car for a long moment without turning the engine on. My phone buzzed with messages, group chats, jokes, plans for brunch the next day, but none of them were meant for me. I pulled the check out again and studied it under the dome light. The paper was thick. The ink was dark. My name was written carefully, not rushed, not careless. I had seen my grandfather sign documents before. This wasn't playful. This was precise. $1 million was more money than I had ever imagined touching. It could erase my student loans. It could change where I lived. It could buy me time, actual time to breathe. Or it could humiliate me. My father's voice echoed in my head. "Don't embarrass yourself." He had said it my whole life in 100 different ways. Don't ask. Don't try. Don't reach for things that aren't meant for you. I started the car. On the drive home, the city was quiet streets, slick with leftover fireworks debris. I thought about all the times I had trusted my parents when they told me not to push, not to question, not to expect more. I thought about how often they had been wrong. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, the decision had already settled in me like a fact. I wasn't going to tell anyone, not my parents, not my siblings, not even my friends. The next morning I would walk into the bank alone. If the check was fake, I would deal with that reality myself. If it was real, then everything was about to change. I set the check on my kitchen counter and stared at it one last time before going to bed. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I felt strangely calm, as if some part of me had been waiting years for this exact moment. They thought belief was naive. They thought trust was weakness. They were wrong. And tomorrow I would prove it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face leaning toward me, his voice low and certain, telling me not to embarrass myself. I replayed my mother's laugh, the way it cut through the room and turned something serious into a joke. I heard my brother's easy confidence, my sister's dismissive silence. And underneath it all, I remembered my grandfather's hand steadying mine as he passed me the check. By the time morning light crept through my blinds, I knew I wasn't going to get any more rest. I lay there listening to the building wake up around me, footsteps in the hallway, a door slamming somewhere below, the distant sound of traffic starting up. It was New Year's Day, technically a holiday, but the world didn't feel celebratory. It felt suspended, like it was holding its breath. I got up slowly and made coffee I barely tasted. The check was still on my kitchen counter, exactly where I'd left it. I hadn't hidden it. I hadn't framed it. I hadn't treated it like a souvenir. I'd left it in plain sight, as if daring myself to look at it again. $1 million. I picked it up and ran my thumb along the edge. The paper didn't feel flimsy. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt deliberate. My phone buzzed, startling me. A message from my brother. "So, did you actually keep Grandpa's fake check? Or did you toss it like the rest of us?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. His tone was casual, almost amused, as if this were all harmless entertainment. As if there was no cost to laughing something off. I didn't reply. Another message came through almost immediately, this time from my sister. "Mom says you were really quiet last night. You okay?" I exhaled slowly. Even concern in my family came wrapped in judgment. If I was quiet, it meant something was wrong with me, not with them. I set my phone face down on the table. I thought about all the times I had explained myself justified. My choices softened my words, so no one else would feel uncomfortable. I thought about how exhausting it had been, how little it had ever changed. This time I chose silence. I showered, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, nothing that suggested drama or importance. If I was going to the bank, I wanted to look like I belonged there, like I wasn't trying to prove anything. As I pulled on my coat, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my mother. "Please tell me you didn't take Dad seriously last night," her message read. "He was just trying to protect you." Protect me. From what? From disappointment, from hope, from the possibility that something good might actually be meant for me. I didn't answer. I slipped my phone into my bag and zipped it closed, trapping the noise inside. The check went into the folder, pressed flat and careful, like something that deserved respect, even if no one else thought it did. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky a pale winter blue. The street was quieter than usual, most people still sleeping off the night before. As I walked to my car, I felt strangely alone and strangely steady at the same time. The drive gave me too much time to think. I remembered being 12 years old, standing in the kitchen while my parents talked about my brother's future like it was already written. The internships he'd have, the opportunities waiting for him. I remembered asking once quietly what they thought I should do someday. My father had shrugged and said, "You'll figure it out." I remembered being 16 and asking for help, paying for a summer program I'd been accepted into. My mother had frowned and told me it wasn't practical. My brother went to a similar program the next year without question. At 22, when I graduated and moved into my first tiny apartment, they'd told me they were proud of me for being so low maintenance. I had smiled then, too, not realizing that praise was just another way of saying I didn't cost them anything. As I pulled up near the bank, my phone buzzed again. I ignored it. I parked and sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. This was the point of no return. If I walked inside, I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't tell myself I was being dramatic or sensitive or ungrateful. If I didn't walk inside, I would spend the rest of my life wondering. I grabbed my bag and stepped out of the car. The bank's glass doors reflected me back at myself. I looked normal, ordinary. No one could tell I was carrying a check that could either change my life or confirm every doubt my family had ever planted in me. Before I reached the door, my phone vibrated again, insistent this time. I glanced at the screen. A missed call from my father. I could almost hear what he would say. That I was being foolish. That I was setting myself up. That I should listen to him, trust him, do what he said. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to comply. I turned my phone off completely. As I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the warmth of the bank washed over me. The quiet hum of voices, the soft clicking of keyboards, the normal rhythm of people going about their business. No one looked at me. No one laughed. No one warned me not to embarrass myself. I walked toward the line, the folder heavy in my hands. Whatever happened next, I was done letting my family decide what I was worthy of. I was about to find out the truth on my own. The line was shorter than I expected. 3 people ahead of me, all of them distracted by their phones or paperwork. All of them unaware that I was holding something that could either validate my entire life or confirm every quiet insult I had ever swallowed. I stood still, the folder tucked against my side, my shoulders relaxed on purpose. I didn't want to look nervous. I didn't want to look hopeful either. The bank smelled faintly of coffee and paper. The floor shone under the overhead lights. Somewhere behind the counter, a printer hummed steadily, indifferent to my internal storm. I shifted my weight and stared straight ahead. This was the moment my father had warned me about. This was the humiliation he was so sure I couldn't survive. I imagined myself sliding the check across the counter and watching the teller's expression change. Imagined her apologetic smile. Imagined the quiet request to step aside. I imagined the heat rising in my face the way it always did when I felt exposed. I told myself that if that happened, I would still walk out with my head up. Because humiliation wasn't new to me. I had been trained in it. Growing up, embarrassment had been my responsibility to manage. If my brother interrupted me, I was told not to be so sensitive. If my sister took credit for something I'd done, I was told it wasn't worth making a fuss. If my parents dismissed my concerns, I was told to stop overthinking. Don't make things awkward. Don't draw attention. Don't embarrass yourself. I had learned to anticipate disappointment before it arrived, to soften my expectations so they couldn't hurt me as much when they inevitably fell through. Standing there in that line, I felt all of that conditioning pressing in, urging me to leave, urging me to turn around and pretend none of this mattered. The man in front of me finished his transaction and stepped away. 2 people left. My phone vibrated in my bag even though it was off. Or maybe that was just my imagination. I resisted the urge to check it. Whatever my family wanted to say could wait. This wasn't their moment. This was mine. I glanced around the lobby, noticing small details I'd never paid attention to before. A framed photo on the wall of the bank's founding team. A bowl of pens chained to the counter. A woman near the exit quietly counting cash before slipping it into her purse. Ordinary things, grounding things. I focused on my breathing, in through my nose, out through my mouth. I thought about my grandfather again. About the way he had watched the room the night before, not smiling when everyone laughed, not joining in the mockery. About how his eyes had followed me as I folded the check and put it away. He had known exactly what would happen next. That thought steadied me. The next person finished and walked past me without a glance. I stepped forward now, the first in line. The teller behind the counter was young, maybe my age, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression open and neutral. She smiled at the customer in front of her, the practiced smile of someone who had done this 1,000 times. As I waited, my mind drifted uninvited to a memory I hadn't thought about in years. I was 19, home from college for the holidays, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and a job application form. I had been working 2 part-time jobs and still coming up short. I had finally worked up the courage to ask my parents if they could help me cover 1 month's rent until my next paycheck came through. My father hadn't even looked at the papers. He'd leaned back in his chair and said, "You need to learn how to handle things on your own." My mother had nodded in agreement. "We don't want you getting used to handouts." I had nodded too, swallowing my embarrassment, telling myself they were right, that independence was something to be proud of, that needing help was weakness. A week later, I'd watched them write a check to help my brother with a down payment on a car. No lectures, no lessons. That memory faded as the teller turned her attention to me. "Next," she said pleasantly. I stepped up to the counter and placed the folder down carefully. My hands were steady. I was proud of that. I opened the folder and slid the check toward her without a word. She picked it up casually at first, the way people do when they expect nothing unusual. Her eyes moved over the paper, down to the amount, back to the name. Her smile faltered. Not dramatically. Just enough. She looked at the check again, slower this time, then glanced up at me with a different expression. Not suspicion, not judgment. Focus. "May I see your ID, please?" she asked. I handed it over. She compared the name, nodded once, and typed something into her computer. The clicking of the keys sounded louder than it should have. My heart thudded in my chest, but I kept my face calm, my posture relaxed. "I'm going to need to have this verified," she said politely. "It may take a few minutes." "That's fine," I replied, my voice even. She took the check and my ID and walked toward the back, disappearing through a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." And then I was alone at the counter. This was the waiting my father had warned me about. This was the moment where people started to notice, where eyes lingered, where assumptions were made. I could feel someone behind me shifting impatiently. I could sense curiosity in the air, subtle but present. I didn't turn around. I rested my hands on the counter and stared straight ahead, refusing to shrink. I thought about all the times I had waited quietly for approval that never came. All the times I had stood on the sidelines while others were chosen, praised, supported. All the times I had told myself that it didn't matter. It mattered. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time blurred. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A man stepped out from behind the door the teller had disappeared through. He was older, dressed neatly, his expression composed and serious. He glanced at the check in the teller's hand, then looked directly at me. And in that moment, before he even spoke, I knew something had changed. The man didn't rush toward me. That was the first thing I noticed. He didn't hurry, didn't look flustered, didn't act like something had gone wrong. He walked with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and didn't need to explain himself to anyone. The teller followed a step behind him, holding my check and my ID like they were something delicate. "Miss," the man said when he reached the counter. His voice was measured, professional. "I'm the branch manager." He didn't say his name yet. He didn't need to. The way the people behind the counter subtly straightened told me everything I needed to know. "I just want to confirm a few details with you," he continued. I nodded, my throat suddenly tight. "Okay." He glanced down at the check once more, then back up at me. "You're depositing this today?" "Yes." No hesitation. No apology. "Did you receive this directly from the account holder?" he asked. "Yes." "My grandfather." Something flickered across his face then. Not surprise. Recognition. "I see," he said. He turned slightly to the teller. "Thank you. I'll take it from here." She handed him the documents and stepped away, her curiosity barely contained, but her professionalism intact. I was acutely aware of the quiet that had settled around us. Conversations had dropped to murmurs. The printer seemed louder now. I could feel eyes on my back. The manager gestured toward a small seating area off to the side. "Would you mind stepping over here for a moment?" "Of course." I followed him, my steps steady even as my heart hammered. This was the part my father had warned me about, the part where I was supposed to feel foolish, exposed small. We sat across from each other at a low table. He placed the check between us, aligning it carefully with the edge like it deserved that kind of respect. "I want to be very clear," he said, meeting my gaze. "This is not a problem." I blinked. "It isn't?" I asked before I could stop myself. He gave a small, polite smile. "No. It's simply a large transaction, and we verify those personally." He glanced at the check again, then at a tablet he'd brought with him. "Your grandfather has been a client of this branch for a long time. His accounts are in good standing." My fingers curled slightly in my lap. "So, it's real," I said quietly. He didn't laugh. He didn't soften his words. He didn't reassure me like I was fragile. "Yes," he said. "It's real." The words didn't explode inside me the way I thought they might. There was no rush of joy, no urge to cry. Instead, something settled heavy and solid like a truth finally dropping into place. "It will clear today," he continued. "The funds will be available immediately." I stared at him, my mind scrambling to catch up. "Immediately?" He nodded. "Given the account history, there's no reason to place a hold." I felt lightheaded, then not from excitement, but from the sudden release of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. I gripped the edge of the chair, grounding myself. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone genuinely concerned. "Yes," I said quickly. Thank you." He inclined his head. "Of course." We stood and he walked me back to the counter. The teller returned her eyes, flicking briefly to the manager's face, then to me. Whatever she saw there made her movements careful, almost reverent. She processed the deposit without a word, the click of the keyboard sounding impossibly loud in my ears. When she finished, she printed a receipt and slid it across the counter. "There you go," she said softly. I picked it up and looked down. The number stared back at me, crisp and undeniable. A balance I had never seen attached to my name. A balance my parents had sworn was impossible. I folded the receipt once and tucked it into my bag with the same care I'd given the check. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass doors. I looked the same. Same sweater, same hair pulled back too simply, same tired eyes. But something behind them had changed. Outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and bracing. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing, letting the city noise wash over me. Cars passed. Someone laughed nearby. A bus hissed as it pulled to the curb. The world hadn't shifted on its axis. I had. My phone buzzed as soon as I turned it back on. Missed calls. Messages stacked one on top of another. My brother first. "You seriously tried to deposit it?" Then my sister. "Mom's freaking out." "Did you actually go to the bank?" And finally my father. "Call me. Now." I didn't respond. I walked to my car, got in, and sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel. I thought about the way my father had sneered, the way my mother had laughed, the way they'd all decided for me what was real and what wasn't. They had been so sure. I started the engine and pulled out into traffic, the receipt heavy in my bag, proof pressed flat against my side. They thought the bank would teach me a lesson. Instead, it had done something else entirely. It had taken their certainty and handed it back to me, shattered. And I knew with absolute clarity that this was only the beginning. I didn't drive straight home. I pulled over a few blocks from the bank and sat there with the engine off the car ticking softly as it cooled. My hands were still steady, which surprised me. I had expected shaking tears, something dramatic. Instead, there was a strange, quiet weight settling into my chest. It was real, not symbolic, not conditional, not a joke that would unravel later with an apology attached. Real. I reached into my bag and took out the receipt again, smoothing the paper with my thumb like I needed to reassure myself it hadn't changed. The numbers hadn't moved. They didn't flicker or blur. They stayed exactly where they were, unapologetic and clear. $1 million. I let out a slow breath and leaned my head back against the seat. For a moment, I thought about calling my grandfather, about telling him immediately, about thanking him. But something stopped me. He hadn't asked me to call. He hadn't waited by the phone. He had trusted me to act, not to report. That mattered. My phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't ignore it. I looked down. My brother. Be honest. Did it clear? There was no laughter in that message. No teasing, just urgency, raw and sudden. I typed back 3 words. It cleared. Fully. The response came almost instantly. That's not funny. I stared at the screen, then typed again. I'm not joking. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. You're serious? Yes. There was a pause longer this time. Long enough for me to imagine him standing in his kitchen, phone in hand, his certainty cracking for the first time in his life. Mom said those checks were fake, he finally wrote. Dad said not to try. I watched the words settle on the screen. I tried. I replied. It worked. Another pause. Holy shit, he sent. I threw mine away. I closed my eyes. There it was. The sound of a hierarchy collapsing. I didn't respond. My phone rang a second later. His name flashed across the screen. I let it ring. Not out of cruelty, not out of revenge, but because I understood something new about silence. Silence was power now. I drove home slowly, the city sliding past me in familiar shapes that felt different somehow, as if I were seeing them from a new height. At my apartment, I went inside, kicked off my shoes, and set my bag on the table. The quiet felt heavier here, thicker. No laughter, no commentary, just space. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it standing up, grounding myself in small, ordinary actions. My phone buzzed again. My sister this time. Are you okay? She wrote. Mom says the bank messed up and you need to fix it. I almost laughed. Almost. I typed back carefully. The bank manager personally verified it. Another message came immediately. This is really bad. Dad's saying you could get in trouble. There it was. The shift. Concern masquerading as authority. Fear dressed up as protection. I didn't reply. The phone rang again, and this time it was my father. I stared at his name until it stopped, then rang again. And again. Finally, I answered. What I said, keeping my voice even. Tell me you didn't deposit that check, he said, not bothering with greeting or pretense. I did. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. That was a mistake. It cleared, I said. The funds are available. That doesn't mean anything, he snapped. Banks make errors. You need to call them and tell them it was fake before they realize it and accuse you of fraud. Fraud. The word hung there heavy and threatening. I leaned back against the counter. It's not fake. You don't know that, he said. Your grandfather, I do know that, I interrupted. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The branch manager verified the account. There are sufficient funds. Silence. Then quieter now, more controlled. Your mother and I were trying to protect you. From what I almost asked. From hope. From proof. Protect me from what I said instead. He didn't answer directly. You should have talked to us first. I felt something harden inside me, something that had been soft for too long. Why? Another pause. Another recalculation. Because we're your parents, he said. We know better. I closed my eyes. No, I said. You thought you did. His tone sharpened. You don't understand what you've done. I understand exactly what I've done, I replied. I trusted the person who gave me the check. You embarrassed yourself, he said, the old phrase slipping out like a reflex. I almost smiled. No, I said. I didn't. He started to speak again, but I ended the call before he could finish. My hands were shaking now, but not with fear, with clarity. My phone buzzed once more. This time the name that appeared made me still completely. My grandfather. The message was short. Did you deposit it? Yes, I typed back. A moment passed. Good, he replied. Come to my house tonight. 7. Don't discuss this with anyone. I stared at the message, my heartbeat steadying. Okay, I wrote. I set the phone down and looked around my small kitchen at the mismatched chairs, the chipped mug on the counter, the life I had built piece by piece without help. The money in my account could change all of this. But I knew deep down that wasn't why my grandfather had done what he did. This wasn't a gift. It was a test. And I had passed it. Whatever came next wasn't about the bank anymore. It was about everything my family had decided for me without ever asking. I picked up the receipt one more time and folded it carefully, not like a trophy, but like evidence. Tonight I would learn why I was the only one he trusted. And tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same again. I arrived at my grandfather's house just before 7, the sky already dark and heavy with winter. The lights inside were warm, steady, nothing like the sharp glare of my parents' place. He opened the door himself before I could knock, as if he'd been waiting right there listening for my steps. You came alone, he said. Yes. He nodded once. Good. That was all he said before turning and walking back into the house, trusting me to follow. I shrugged off my coat and hung it where he gestured. The house smelled faintly of wood polish and old books, familiar and grounding. This was the place where I'd spent weekends as a child, where I'd learned to play chess, where I'd been allowed to ask questions without being told I was difficult. We sat across from each other in his study, the same room where he'd always done his thinking. A heavy desk stood between us, clean except for a single folder placed neatly in the center. He didn't touch it yet. Did anyone try to stop you today? He asked. I considered the question. They tried to scare me. He smiled slightly, not amused, not surprised. Of course they did. They said the bank made a mistake, I continued. That I could get in trouble. And you, I didn't argue, I said. I just told them it cleared. His smile deepened just a fraction. That was the right choice. I shifted in my chair. My brother threw his check away. I know. My sister didn't even look at hers. I know that too. I stared at him. You knew all of that would happen. Yes. There was no hesitation in his voice, no regret. Just certainty. He finally placed his hand on the folder but still didn't open it. Before we go any further, he said, I need to know something. Why did you deposit the check? The question caught me off guard. I had expected him to explain himself, not ask me to explain me. Because you gave it to me, I said slowly. And because you've never lied to me. He leaned back in his chair, studying my face the way he used to when I was young and trying to bluff my way through a bad chess move. And when everyone else told you it was fake, I still trusted you, I said. More than them. He nodded once firmly. That's what I needed to confirm. I swallowed. Confirm what? That you're the only one who listens without filtering everything through your parents, he said. The only one who decides for herself. I frowned. This wasn't just about the money. No, he said. It never was. He opened the folder then, but only enough to show me the edge of thick paper inside. Documents. Many of them. Old ones, some yellowed with age. I gave 4 checks last night, he said calmly. Only one was real. My chest tightened, even though I already knew the answer. Yours, he said. I nodded. I figured. The others, he continued, were written from an account that would never clear. If any of them had tried to deposit their checks, they would have been embarrassed. Publicly. I thought about my brother's laughter, the way he'd tossed his check aside without a second thought. About my sister folding hers like it was nothing. About my parents' certainty. You set them up, I said quietly. I tested them, he corrected. There's a difference. I met his gaze. What were you testing? Trust, he said without hesitation. Judgment. Integrity. He folded his hands together. I needed to know who in this family still knows how to think independently, who listens to me instead of to the loudest voice in the room. And they failed, I said. Yes. I felt a strange mix of emotions swirl inside me. Vindication, sadness, something like grief for a family that had never been what I'd hoped it could be. Why now, I asked. Why do this at all? He looked tired suddenly, older than his years. Because I've learned something over the last decade, he said. Something that took me too long to see. He tapped the folder lightly. And because I needed to know who I could trust with what comes next. A chill ran through me. What comes next? He studied me for a long moment before answering. The truth, he said. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. I straightened in my chair. You're talking about my parents? Yes. The word hung between us, heavy and unavoidable. He didn't open the folder yet. Instead, he leaned forward. Before I show you anything, I want to give you a choice. I frowned. A choice? You can leave now, he said. You can walk out that door and go back to your life as it was. I won't blame you. No one else will ever know what I was about to tell you. And if I stay, everything changes, he said simply. Your relationship with your parents, with your siblings, with this family. I thought about my father's voice on the phone, about my mother's laughter, about the way they'd all decided what was real without ever checking. I didn't need long to decide. I'm staying, I said. He nodded, satisfaction flickering across his face. I thought you would. He opened the folder fully this time and slid it toward me, but he didn't let go. What you're about to see, he said, his voice low and steady, explains why they were so confident you wouldn't deposit that check. My heart began to pound. It explains why you were always told to handle things on your own, he continued, and why your brother never had to. I reached for the folder, my fingers brushing the edge of the paper. This isn't about favoritism, he said. It's about something far worse. I looked up at him. What? His eyes didn't waver. It's about theft. The word landed like a blow. From you, he added. The room seemed to shrink around us, the walls pressing in as the weight of that single word settled into my bones. I had spent my life believing I was overlooked. I was about to learn I had been taken from. And suddenly the $1 million in my bank account felt like the smallest part of what was about to be revealed. The folder felt heavier than it looked. I rested my hands on the edge of the desk, not opening it yet, as if delaying the moment would somehow soften what waited inside. My grandfather watched me carefully, not impatient, not rushing me. He had always been like that. He understood that some truths needed space before they could be faced. You said theft, I finally said. From me. Yes. The word still rang in my ears. Theft wasn't favoritism. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't the quiet, emotional absence I had learned to live with. Theft meant intent. It meant choice. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. Before I explain, he said, I need you to understand something. None of this was accidental, and none of it started recently. I swallowed. How long? Years, he said. More than you'd like." The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I had grown up hearing that clock during long afternoons at his house, never imagining it would one day measure out something like this. "I trusted your parents," he continued. "I trusted them because they were my son and my daughter-in-law. Because I believed that no one would ever deliberately harm their own child." My chest tightened at that. I looked down at the folder again, my fingers curling slightly. "I gave them money regularly," he said. "Not small amounts, substantial ones. Always with instructions, always with the same expectation. For what I asked. For you," he said simply. "For your siblings. Equally." I looked up at him sharply. "Equally, yes." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Education support. Emergency funds. Help getting started. I wanted each of my grandchildren to have a fair foundation. The same opportunities." A strange buzzing filled my ears. "I never got any of that." "I know." The way he said it, quiet certain, sent a chill through me. "I only found out because things stopped adding up," he went on. "Your parents kept telling me how well you were doing, how independent you were, how you didn't need much help. But when I looked at your life, your apartment, your work hours, your debt, it didn't match." I let out a humorless laugh. "They called that independence." "Yes," he said. "They used that word often." He reached forward and finally opened the folder. Inside were documents. Stacks of them. Bank statements. Copies of checks. Spreadsheets neatly annotated in his precise handwriting. Dates jumped out at me first. Years. So many years. He slid the top page toward me. This was the first time, he said. "At least the first time I can prove." I stared at the page. It showed a transfer from him to my parents, clearly labeled, followed by notes indicating how it was supposed to be distributed. My name was there. So was an amount I had never seen in my life. "I don't understand," I whispered. "You were supposed to receive it," he said. "You didn't." My throat tightened. "What happened to it?" He met my eyes. It was redirected. The word landed hard. "To your brother," he continued. "Or kept. Sometimes split. Sometimes explained away as expenses you didn't need." A memory surfaced sharp and unwanted. Me at 21 explaining that I couldn't afford to replace my laptop when it died. My mother telling me it was a good lesson in budgeting. My brother getting a brand new one a month later. I pressed my lips together. It happened again the following year, my grandfather said, turning the page. And the year after that. He didn't rush through it. He didn't soften the language. He let the pattern speak for itself. Year after year, money designated for me never reached me. Instead, I saw notes about additional support for my brother. Extra help. Business ideas. Investments. Loans that were never repaid. My sister benefited too, though less directly. Her tuition gaps filled quietly. Her emergencies covered. Mine were ignored. I asked them, I said hoarsely. So many times. I asked for help. "I know," he said. "They told me you never did." I closed my eyes. "They told me you were proud of handling things on your own," he went on. "That you didn't want assistance. That you preferred independence." I opened my eyes again, anger finally burning through the numbness. "That's a lie." "Yes," he said. "It is." I pushed the folder away slightly, needing distance. "Why would they do this?" He exhaled slowly. "Because it was easier," he said. "Because you didn't push. Because you didn't make scenes. Because they knew you would survive." Survive. The word felt like an accusation. They convinced themselves they were doing the right thing, he added. That your brother needed more. That you were strong enough without it. I laughed softly, the sound brittle. "So they decided I deserved less." "They decided you could be sacrificed," he said quietly. Silence fell between us, thick and heavy. I looked back at the documents, at the undeniable proof that my struggles hadn't been bad luck or personal failure. They had been engineered or at least permitted. I thought I was just overlooked, I said. I thought I wasn't enough. He shook his head firmly. You were convenient. The word cut deeper than I expected. I sat back in my chair, my hands trembling now not from fear but from the sheer scale of what I was seeing. This wasn't one mistake. It wasn't one bad decision. It was a system. My grandfather closed the folder gently. That's why I needed to know who would trust me, he said. Who would listen when I said something mattered. He looked at me with an intensity that made my chest ache. Because what I just showed you isn't everything. I stiffened. There's more. Yes. I stared at him, my mind racing. What else could there be? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to a cabinet against the wall, unlocking it with a small key from his pocket. He pulled out another folder thicker than the first and placed it on the desk beside me. This, he said, is why the check was never about money. My pulse quickened. Then what was it about? He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. It was about finding out who could handle the truth, he said. And who couldn't. I looked down at the second folder, my hands hovering over it, knowing that once I opened it, there would be no going back. I had walked into his house thinking I was about to learn why my family didn't value me. I was about to learn something far worse. They had known exactly what they were doing, and they had expected to get away with it forever. The second folder was heavier, thicker, and older. When I opened it, the smell of paper and time rose up together, faint but unmistakable. These weren't recent printouts or summaries prepared for effect. These were originals, copies made long ago and kept not forgotten. My grandfather sat back and let me read. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. There were headings, dates, account names that meant nothing to me yet. But then I saw it. My name. Typed, not handwritten, repeated again and again across different pages. Each line followed the same pattern. Funds allocated. Purpose noted. Distribution expected. And then, nothing. The column where confirmation should have been was blank. Or worse, filled with annotations in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Not received, redirected, no confirmation provided. My stomach turned. This is a trust, I said quietly. Yes, he replied. Or rather, it was meant to be. I looked up at him. I never had a trust fund. No, he said. You were supposed to. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thin. I turned back to the papers, my fingers tracing lines I hadn't known existed. A trust established years ago. My grandfather's signature. My parents listed as temporary administrators until I reached a certain age. My age. 25. I was 26 now. They were supposed to transfer control to you last year, he said. They never did. A memory surfaced unbidden. My parents sitting across from me at a restaurant on my birthday telling me they were proud of how self-sufficient I'd become. How they'd always known I didn't need safety nets. Safety nets. They told me there was nothing set aside for me, I said. They said everything had gone to my education when I was younger. He shook his head. Your education was funded separately. This was never touched by you. My hands began to shake as I turned another page. Amounts I didn't want to calculate. Years I didn't want to count. This wasn't one decision, I whispered. It was ongoing. Yes, he said. That's why I kept records. I looked at him sharply. You suspected. I noticed patterns, he said carefully. At first I thought it was mismanagement. Then I thought it was favoritism. I didn't want to believe it was worse. And when did you know, I asked? When you called me from the hospital, he said quietly. I froze. I remembered that night. A minor accident, nothing life-threatening but enough to scare me. I'd called my parents first. They hadn't answered. I'd called my brother. He was busy. So I'd called my grandfather, embarrassed, apologizing for bothering him. He'd come immediately. "You asked me if you should leave early because you couldn't afford to miss work," he continued. "You were injured, exhausted, and still worried about money. That didn't make sense." I swallowed hard. "I started looking deeper after that," he said, quietly. I flipped another page and felt something inside me crack. There were transfers here too. Smaller amounts, labeled discretionary, emergency coverage, short-term support, all marked as delivered, not to me. I remembered standing in my kitchen years ago, staring at an overdraft notice, deciding which bill could wait. I remembered telling myself it was temporary, that everyone struggled. I remembered my mother telling me I was dramatic when I asked for help. "You were never irresponsible," my grandfather said. "You were deprived." The word landed with finality. I pushed the folder away and pressed my palms to my eyes, breathing slowly, carefully. I didn't cry. I couldn't. It was too much, too layered, too methodical for tears. "This wasn't about loving them more," I said hoarsely. "This was about controlling resources." "Yes," he said, "and controlling narratives." I looked back at him. "They made me believe I was difficult for needing help. They made you believe the absence of support was a character trait," he said, "not a choice they were making." Anger surged then, sharp and hot, but underneath it was something colder. Clarity. "They told you I didn't want help," I said. "Yes." "They told me you didn't give any." "Yes." "They stood in the middle," I whispered, "and took everything." He didn't correct me. I sat there, the weight of it settling into every memory I had. Every time I'd said no to something because I couldn't afford it. Every opportunity I'd walked away from. Every moment I'd believed I was simply less deserving. "I wasn't unlucky," I said slowly. "No," he agreed. "You were chosen." The room was silent again. The clock ticked on. After a moment, he spoke. "I didn't show you this to punish them." I looked up. "Then why?" "Because silence protects the wrong people," he said, "and because the truth belongs to you." I nodded, though my head felt heavy. "What happens now?" I asked. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "Now we decide what accountability looks like." The word sent a chill through me. "I won't force you," he added. "But understand this. What they did wasn't just immoral. It was illegal." I stared at the folder, at my name printed again and again, like a promise broken repeatedly. "They never thought I'd find out," I said. "No," he replied. "They thought you would keep surviving quietly." I closed the folder carefully, deliberately. "They were wrong," I said. He watched me for a long moment, then nodded once. "Yes," he said. "They were." I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, but my resolve firming with every breath. The truth hurt, but it didn't weaken me. It rearranged me. I had spent years believing my struggles were personal failures. Now I knew they were evidence. And for the first time I understood that the check wasn't the story. It was the door. And I had already walked through it. The brunch was already loud when we arrived. Laughter spilled out through the open windows, the clatter of dishes and the false warmth of voices blending into a familiar soundtrack I had grown up with. My parents' house looked exactly the same, fresh wreath on the door, expensive car in the driveway, everything polished to suggest nothing had ever gone wrong here. My grandfather didn't hesitate. He rang the bell once and stepped inside without waiting. The room froze. Forks paused midair. Conversations died in place. My father stood at the head of the table, mimosa glass in hand, smiling out of habit until he saw the briefcase. My mother's smile faltered first. "What's this?" she asked, her tone light, rehearsed. "We weren't expecting a meeting." My grandfather set the briefcase on the table with deliberate calm. "You weren't supposed to expect it." I stayed beside him, my heart pounding but my spine straight. This wasn't a confrontation fueled by rage. It was something colder, something prepared. My brother shifted in his chair. My sister frowned, already annoyed. Cousins exchanged looks. No one spoke. "Sit," my grandfather said. Something in his voice carried authority that didn't invite debate. Chairs scraped. People sat. He opened the briefcase. The sound of the latches clicking open was louder than it should have been. He pulled out the first document and slid it across the table toward my father. "Read." My father glanced at it, then at me. His jaw tightened. "Dad, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," my grandfather replied. My mother leaned forward, scanning the page, her face drained of color. "What is this?" she demanded. 10 years of distributions," my grandfather said evenly. "Money allocated for my granddaughter. Money that never reached her." My brother laughed nervously. "This is a misunderstanding. Mom handles all that." "Yes," my grandfather said. "She did." He laid out the next document. Then another. Dates. Amounts. Signatures. My name highlighted again and again, paired with numbers that had never touched my life. My sister pushed her chair back slightly. "This feels dramatic." I met her eyes. "It feels that way because you weren't the one living it." Silence fell again. My father stood abruptly. "You're accusing us of theft in front of everyone. I'm presenting evidence," my grandfather said. "The accusation is yours to accept or deny." My mother's voice cracked. "We did what we thought was best. She never needed as much help as the others." I felt the room tilt. "You decided that," I said quietly. "Without telling me. Without telling him." My grandfather nodded. "You intercepted funds you were entrusted to distribute. You redirected them. You concealed it." My father slammed his glass down. "You don't understand family dynamics." "I understand fiduciary duty," my grandfather replied, "and you violated it." My brother finally looked at the documents more closely. "Wait," he said. "Those amounts, that was supposed to be split." My grandfather turned to him. "Yes. And I got more?" he asked slowly. "You did," my grandfather said. "Consistently." My brother's face flushed. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," my grandfather said. That landed hard. My sister crossed her arms. "So what is this? Some kind of public shaming?" "No," my grandfather said. "This is accountability." He reached into the briefcase again and pulled out a single sheet, setting it at the center of the table. "This is your choice," he said. "You repay every dollar taken with interest. Or I proceed legally." My mother let out a small, sharp laugh. "You wouldn't do that." "I already have," he said calmly. I watched her realize it in stages, the stiffness in her shoulders, the calculation in her eyes, the sudden awareness of witnesses. "This will destroy us," my father said hoarsely. "No," my grandfather replied. "What you did destroyed her. This simply ends the lie." I felt everyone's eyes turn to me. For years I had avoided moments like this. I had minimized myself to keep the peace. I had swallowed discomfort to avoid scenes. Not today. "I didn't come here to take anything from you," I said. "I came because I was taken from." My voice didn't shake. I was told I was independent because I had to be. I was told I didn't need help while help was taken in my name. I was made smaller so others could be bigger. My brother stared at his hands. My sister's eyes filled with tears she didn't wipe away. My grandfather closed the briefcase. "You have 48 hours. He turned and walked toward the door. I followed. Behind us, chaos erupted, voices, overlapping excuses, rising panic setting in, but none of it reached me anymore. Outside, the air was cool and sharp. I breathed it in like relief. "Are you all right?" my grandfather asked. I nodded slowly. "I think I am now." He looked at me with something like pride. Whatever happens next, he said, you didn't imagine your pain, and you didn't cause it. I watched the front door behind us, the place that had held so many versions of me I no longer needed to be. I won't go back, I said. He placed a hand on my shoulder. You don't have to. As we walked to the car, I felt something lift. Not anger, not triumph, but certainty. The truth was out. And whatever followed it would finally be honest. The lawsuit moved faster than I expected. Within days, my parents stopped calling and started strategizing. Silence from them felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. Their lawyer reached out first, a polite email wrapped in careful language about misunderstandings and family intentions. I didn't respond. My grandfather handled everything now exactly as he said he would. I went back to my apartment and tried to keep living my normal life. I went to work, answered emails, smiled at coworkers who had no idea my family was imploding behind closed doors. At night, I lay awake replaying moments from my childhood, seeing them differently. Every, we can't afford it. Every, you'll be fine. Every time I was told to be patient while others were rewarded. It had never been about money alone. It had been about worth. The first settlement offer arrived a week later. It was insulting. A fraction of what had been taken, framed as a generous compromise. No admission of wrongdoing, no apology. Just a quiet suggestion that I take it and move on. My grandfather didn't hesitate. He slid the paper back into the envelope and tore it in half. They still think this is negotiable, he said. It's not, I replied. The second offer came after subpoenas were filed. This one was higher, desperate in tone. My father tried calling me that night, left a voicemail filled with regret that never quite crossed into responsibility. He said they'd made mistakes, that they loved me, that family shouldn't be destroyed over money. I deleted it without listening to the end. When depositions began, the truth stopped being abstract. I wasn't in the room when my parents were questioned, but I read the transcripts. Every contradiction was there in black and white. Dates they couldn't remember. Checks they claimed were gifts. Funds they said they redistributed for family harmony. Harmony. The word made me sick. My brother testified next. He admitted he hadn't known the exact numbers. He admitted he'd accepted help without asking where it came from. He admitted he'd assumed I was fine because I never complained. That hurt more than I expected. Not because he was cruel, but because he hadn't bothered to look. My sister's testimony was quieter. She cried. She said she trusted our parents. She said she didn't realize favoritism had crossed into theft. She said she was sorry. It didn't erase anything, but it landed differently. The trial itself lasted less than a week. I sat behind my grandfather, hands folded, listening as years of my life were laid out as evidence. Charts, bank statements, memos with my name typed clearly, undeniably. Every excuse my parents had ever given dissolved under scrutiny. When my father took the stand, he didn't look at me. When my mother spoke, her voice trembled, but her words stayed defensive. She said she'd done what any mother would do. She said I was strong, independent, capable. I wondered when strength had become justification for neglect. The verdict came quickly. Liability on all counts. Restitution ordered. Penalties added. Public record. The room felt strangely still when the judge finished reading. No dramatic gasps, no shouting, just the sound of something irreversible settling into place. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, cameras pointed, questions shouted. My grandfather stepped in front of me without hesitation. No statements, he said calmly. This is not entertainment. We walked past them together. That night, my parents' house went on the market. A month later, it sold. I didn't drive by. I didn't need to. The image of them packing up their perfect life felt hollow, not satisfying. Consequences didn't bring joy. They brought closure. My brother showed up at my door one evening unannounced. He looked smaller than I remembered. I didn't know how bad it was, he said. I know, I replied. That doesn't make it okay, he said. No, I agreed. He asked if we could fix things. I told him maybe someday, but not now. Healing wasn't something I could rush to make others comfortable. He nodded, left without arguing. My grandfather's health declined shortly after the trial ended. Stress took its toll. He tired easily, moved slower. I spent most evenings at his house cooking simple meals, listening to stories I hadn't heard before. Stories about his early failures, about mistakes he'd made as a father, about how guilt had blinded him longer than he wanted to admit. "I should have protected you sooner," he said once. "You did," I told him, "when it mattered." He smiled at that. When he passed, it was quiet. No drama. Just a peaceful ending to a life that had finally been honest. The will was contested, of course. It didn't hold. Everything he promised came to me. The house, the accounts, the responsibility. Standing in his study weeks later, I touched the framed copy of the check he'd given me, the one no one else believed in. I understood then that it had never been about testing money. It had been about testing truth. I wasn't the strongest in my family. I wasn't the favorite. I wasn't the loudest. I was the one who listened, the one who trusted, the one who treated something meaningful with respect when others laughed. That was what he saw. And that was what changed everything. The house felt too big at first. Every sound echoed. Every hallway carried memories that weren't mine, but were now my responsibility. I moved through it slowly, room by room, learning how to live inside a legacy without being swallowed by it. People assumed inheritance felt like winning. What it actually felt like was standing alone after an earthquake, surrounded by ruins that once passed for family. Condolences arrived first, then curiosity, then entitlement disguised as concern. Distant relatives reached out, people who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly remembering my name. Old family friends sent letters about how much my grandfather would have wanted unity, forgiveness, healing. None of them asked how I was. I changed my phone number. Grief arrived late. It waited until the paperwork was done, until the lawyers stopped calling, until the house stopped feeling like a project and started feeling like a home. Then it came quietly in the evenings when I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to call him. There was no one to call. I kept busy on purpose. I met with advisors. I learned. I asked questions. I refused anything that sounded like a shortcut. I remembered how my grandfather had built everything slowly, deliberately, without flash. I wasn't interested in becoming rich. I was interested in becoming grounded. My parents tried one last time. A letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, heavy with careful phrasing. My mother wrote about regret, about therapy, about misunderstanding. My father wrote about family bonds and second chances. They asked to meet, neutral territory, coffee. I read it once, then I put it away. Some doors once closed aren't slammed shut. They're sealed quietly, permanently, because reopening them would only let old smoke back in. My brother sent an email a few weeks later. Longer this time, less defensive. He acknowledged his role, not just what he'd taken, but what he'd ignored. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said he was learning how silence could be a form of harm. I replied with 2 sentences. I told him I believed growth was possible. I told him distance was still necessary. My sister and I exchanged occasional messages. Not about the past, not about money. Just surface things. Books, weather, her work, my routines. It wasn't reconciliation. It was acknowledgement. That felt honest. The foundation came next. I named it after my grandfather, not because he wanted recognition, but because his values deserved continuity. Integrity, merit, accountability, opportunity without favoritism. I funded scholarships quietly, supported programs that helped young women build independence without debt swallowing them whole. I didn't announce it. I didn't need applause. The check stayed framed in my office not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Of the moment everything broke open. Of the moment I stopped shrinking to survive. Sometimes I'd sit there and think about the girl I had been at that table. 26, mocked, dismissed, told she was unworthy of believing in something good. I wished I could reach back and tell her she wasn't naive. She was perceptive. She saw value where others saw spectacle. She trusted sincerity when everyone else followed the loudest voice in the room. She listened when it mattered. That wasn't weakness. That was discernment. I learned something else, too. Revenge wasn't what I'd imagined. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't satisfying in the way stories make it seem. It was quiet, legal, methodical. It didn't raise my voice. It raised my boundaries. Justice didn't arrive with cheers. It arrived with peace. On some mornings I walked the garden my grandfather had loved, coffee in hand, sunlight filtering through trees he'd planted decades before. I felt him there not as a ghost but as a standard. He had trusted me when no one else did. I trusted myself now. The world didn't suddenly become kind. People still underestimated me, still made assumptions, still smiled politely while doubting my competence. The difference was I no longer needed to correct them. I let results speak. I let silence do its work. I let distance protect what mattered. If there was one thing I carried forward, it was this believing someone shows who you are, not how foolish you are. I believed my grandfather when others mocked him. And because of that, I inherited more than money. I inherited truth. I inherited freedom. I inherited the certainty that I was never unworthy, only surrounded by people who needed me to think I was. And that chapter of my life was finally, definitively closed. I still remember the exact moment I realized the story was truly over. It wasn't when the papers were signed. It wasn't when the house became legally mine. It wasn't even when my parents stopped trying to reach me. It was a quiet afternoon months later when I found myself laughing, really laughing over something small and unimportant, and then realizing there was no weight attached to it. No guilt, no fear of being judged, no voice in my head asking if I was allowed to feel that light. That was when I knew. Freedom didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived gently, like permission I no longer needed to ask for. I had changed my routines without realizing it. I slept better. I spoke more slowly. I stopped over-explaining myself. I noticed how often I used to apologize for things that weren't wrong. Existing, taking space, saying no. Now no felt complete. People sometimes asked if I missed my family. They expected a dramatic answer. Anger, grief, vindication. The truth was simpler. I missed the idea of what they should have been. I didn't miss who they actually were. That distinction mattered. When I thought of my father now, I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. His words at that New Year's celebration, telling me I didn't deserve it, had revealed more about him than about me. He needed me small so his version of the world could stay intact. It didn't. My mother's laughter, sharp and dismissive, no longer echoed in my head. It had lost its power the moment it was exposed to daylight. Mockery only works in silence. Once spoken aloud and challenged, it collapses. And my grandfather, he stayed with me in ways I hadn't expected. In decisions, in restraint, in choosing what not to do just as carefully as what to do. I didn't rebuild my life by trying to prove anything to anyone. I rebuilt it by removing the audience. There was no grand speech, no public victory lap, no dramatic reunion scene, just a woman who stopped carrying shame that was never hers. Sometimes late at night I would sit in my grandfather's study and think about the test he had set in motion. People liked to call it clever, strategic, ruthless. I saw it differently. He wasn't testing greed. He was testing respect. Who listened, who mocked, who followed the loudest voice, who paused long enough to ask, "What if this is real?" That was the difference. I had believed him not because I expected to win, but because I refused to participate in cruelty disguised as humor. I refused to treat sincerity like a joke. That choice reshaped everything. If there was karma in this story, it wasn't the money. It wasn't the loss of status. It wasn't the exposed lies. It was alignment. The people who lived by deception ended up trapped inside it. The person who chose honesty walked away unburdened. That was the real inheritance. Today, when I look back at the woman I was at 26, standing in that room while my father sneered and my mother mocked, I don't feel pity for her anymore. I feel respect. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She didn't perform strength. She simply believed what felt true even when everyone told her not to. And that belief carried her out. If you're listening to this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever been told you were unworthy, dramatic, naive, or selfish for trusting your own perception, let me say this clearly. Being underestimated is not a flaw. Being dismissed does not mean you are wrong, and being quiet does not mean you are powerless. Sometimes the most decisive moments of our lives happen when we choose not to laugh along, not to throw something meaningful away, not to agree just to keep the peace. Sometimes believing is the bravest act there is. If this story stirred something in you, I'd love to hear it. You're not alone in this, and your experience matters more than you might think. Share your thoughts in the comments or tell your own story if you feel ready. And if you want to stay here a little longer, if stories like this remind you that truth has weight and integrity still counts, consider staying with us. There are more stories ahead, more quiet reckonings, more moments where the tables turn in unexpected ways. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing. And thank you for being here.